Hello, my name is Roisin and welcome back to my channel. It is November now, and that is known as Non-Fiction November in certain parts of the internet, and so I thought that I would give you 10 of my favourite non-fiction books that I have read in the past 2 years. And the reason I say in the past 2 years is because I made a video like this 2 years ago now of my top 10 favourite non-fiction books, which included books like Sister Outsider and Heavy by Keefe. And so I talked about those all in another video. I will leave that video linked in the cards above if you are interested in checking it out. So I made sure not to repeat myself, which means that these books are all from the past 2 years that I have read, which means I have also read them all on BookTube, so I will try and link as many of the videos where I have read them as I can. But as I mentioned at the start, there are 10 books here, so let's begin. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. This one is the one that is kind of on the borderline between fiction and non-fiction. It is the first in Maya Angelou's 7 series autobiography books, but I think that they are quite embellished and could perhaps even be considered autofiction nowadays. This is the very first one, and the most famous because of that. It is about Maya Angelou's life as a child from her birth up until she is, I think, 15 or 16 years old. In the beginning, she lives with her grandma and her uncle in the south in the 1930s, and it details her experience growing up in that community and her experience of interacting with the different people and the different characters of the town. It has a very bright-eyed young feeling to the very beginning of the book. She really gets that perspective across, but there is also a darkness lingering in the edges of it. In fact, the end of the first sentence is, "If growing up is painful for the southern black girl, being aware of her displacement is the rust on the razor that threatens the throat. It is an unnecessary insult." And so we see the racism present in her life and in the community where she grows up, and also the strong element of Christianity and the strongly patriarchal society and the strongly class-based society in which she grows up as well. Her and her younger brother also go and stay with their mother and their father at different times, and Maya Angelou then experienced other forms of abuse and introduced to the darkness of the world from a very young age. It is obviously a very well-known book, and rightly so. It is very beautifully written, as you heard there. It has really a compelling sense of setting. You can really feel the place that you are reading, and as I said, it definitely reads like a novel, despite being very much based on Maya Angelou's life. It is a book that had that feeling of early 20th century children's novels, but as I said, with the touch of darkness. It had a sense of home and warmth, and all of the people in it are very well-drawn characters, but there is always this undercurrent, and there is always more being said and more beneath the surface than would necessarily be true of other childhood novels. So I think it is a really strong, powerful and engaging read. Next on my list is On Gallows Down by Nicola Chester, and this I read when I was reading the Wainwright Prize for Nature Writing recently, which I will leave linked in the cards above. This tells the story of Nicola Chester's life as a environmental activist, and where she grew up was near Greenham Common, where there was a big women's camp protesting against the nuclear bombs. She also details her experience of campaigning against an M3 bypass that was going to go around the town where she lived, and in doing so she also links back to the history of the place she lived and other people who tried to protect it, for example during the enclosures of common land in the 18th and 19th centuries and the end of the Poor Laws. She talks about walking in the footsteps of other people who had experienced similar things to her, their land being taken over and developed for profit. She talks about becoming a mother and her experience of motherhood, and also of Gallows Down, which is a hill which was split the place where she lived as an adult and the place where she lived as a child. And she concludes it with the talk of her children and their involvement in the Friday strikes where children didn't go to school. It's a really, really wonderful story that I think is so beautifully told. Nicola Chester is a journalist, but it felt much more emotive, creative non-fiction than journalistic writing. I do have another book on here which is written by a journalist and has much more journalistic style, but this one felt much more like it was memoir and personal, but I really enjoyed it. I also loved the way that she linked back to the history of the place and talked about the ways that the countryside has changed over the years, and the people who live in the countryside, that being the main focus. Because while she does talk about saving trees and native species, she really focuses on the people of certain places, and I think she does such a good job of that. Like I said, the writing is really lovely, the descriptions of place, but also the descriptions of her own feeling. If you enjoyed a book I can't remember the name of that I'm going to put here, I think you would really like it. I didn't like that one as much. I think that this one had more breadth to it and took into consideration different things such as class and history in a way that that one didn't, and I really enjoyed it. Whilst reading the Wainwright Prize for Nature Writing, I also read Otherlands by Thomas Halliday. This is a very different book. It is a natural history science kind of book that starts in the Ice Age and then works its way back through, I think it's 13 different ages to the beginning of Earth. And it takes a specific place on the Earth to describe what Earth looked like at that time and the effect that this has on nature. Big, like, mammals of the Ice Age down to single-celled organisms all the way back through time. Like, I'm not someone with a science background, I don't know a lot about science, so I wasn't sure how well I was going to get on with this one. But he does such a great job of world building, which feels interesting to say in a non-fiction book, but because he is describing all of these different ages and what the world looked like at all of these different times, he has to construct that world for you. And I like the way that he used the different parts of the time periods to discuss different things about human understanding and our current day ideas and attitudes. He talks about time frames and how we view things on such a small time frame, and such minor changes seem big because of our little lifespans, but he does bring in ideas about climate change, that the world itself will survive, but it's whether it will still be habitable that is the question. He does a great job of looking at anthropocentrism and the way that we look at climate change based on ourselves rather than based on the world around us. And he also uses it to talk about borders and travelling and the way that plants move, the idea of what is a native plant or what can be considered of a place, because we're always choosing a specific time period when we talk about things like that. Talks about the idea of what is natural. He is reframing things that I think in a really interesting way. Sometimes he starts off with describing these huge things and then you realise that you're actually really tiny in this world, or vice versa, and it's really wonderfully done. It all felt so visual that I could really see it as a television series in the sense of like Walking with Dinosaurs or something. I thought that that would be a really powerful TV series with each of these ages as an episode. It was wonderful, and I would really like to hear him talk more about this sort of thing. I think it's a book that I am going to reread at some point. Last year I read the Bally Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction shortlist, and two of those books really stood out to me as books that I have absolutely loved, and again changed my perspective and made me consider things in a different way. The first one of those is Free by Lea Ypi, the subtitle of which is Coming of Age at the End of History, and it details Lea Ypi's time growing up in Albania during the fall of the communist regime. The way that she sets up the memoir is that we are in her mind as a young girl, her living through communism and her being really like strongly part of the regime, really believing in the things that she is told and the propaganda that is sent through schools. She doesn't know that she is the descendant of the head of Albania before the revolution, but she hears different things from the people around her. Her parents protect her, are not fans of the communist regime, and so they talk in code around her, for example, about people going off to university, which is off to prison. So you as a reader can pick up on things that she doesn't necessarily see, slowly gaining an understanding about the outside world, and it's written with such like childlike eyes. It's then juxtaposed with the fall of communism and the changes that happened in Albania that were harsh and very sudden. People fleeing for Italy, for example, including her own mother, and they're getting involved in politics, her mother and father falling out over it, and the bad loans that were given to Albanian people that caused a lot of people to lose almost all of their money. And Ypi doesn't make judgments until the very end of the book, but she talks about how both sides in this fight, the idealistic fight between capitalism and communism, both view the other as impossible to understand and like the enemy and terrible. And she talks about how the good and the bad that came from both her experiences living under this extreme form of communism and extreme form of capitalism. When she talks to people about her growing up, a lot of them think of her as being like caged and unfree and it being terrible, and she didn't feel that way about her upbringing. Freedoms that she feels like are missing now in Albania that weren't at the time of communism, and not in a way of her saying it is a good thing, just in a way of her saying not everything is so black and white or clear cut. It really allows you to go in with an open mind and to see the way that she saw things. I knew very little about Albania at the time. So it informed me about the historical time period, and it also made me think a lot about politics and identities, about ideas of freedom. A very small little book that packs quite a punch with the information that it shares. Kind of the opposite to that in terms of the size of it. I read Empire of Pain by Radden Keefe last year, and I also really enjoyed that, but it is a very chunky piece of non-fiction. This is the book about the Sackler dynasty, and it talks about the family, and it starts off with the three Sackler brothers. Gives you that kind of almost American dream idealism of the way that they brought themselves up from this lower middle class Jewish family to being very, very wealthy. And then it starts to talk about what it was that they actually eventually made money on, and it talks about Purdue, a pharmaceutical company that they founded and ran because I think they were all doctors. Purdue Pharma were the inventors of Valium and OxyContin, and so it chronological time period of the ways that they went about building those drugs, marketing those drugs, and the effects that those drugs had, and how they got away with ruining so many lives. So it talks about the 1950s and 60s and the tranquilization of large numbers of housewives through their drug Valium, but it also talks about how their practices to sell these drugs and how they were just trying to make money. They didn't properly test their drugs. They said that things were approved because of journals, scientific journals that they set up themselves, and then they go about hiding all of these terrible things that they've had with that and OxyContin, distancing the Sackler name from Purdue Pharma, and getting obsessed with art and station, and using their wealth to buy their way into a cultural elite. It goes from being like this family psychodrama into a courtroom drama when they get sued. You see the differences between generations of this family and the way that they view money and the way that they view other people and each other. This is the book that I was mentioning earlier that is written by a journalist, and I feel like has quite a journalistic feel to it. It's a very compelling story, but you can also see all of the research that's gone into it. And it takes you through the court documents and things like that in such a meticulous way. It's a very, very meticulous, well-researched book, and it's not surprising in terms of rich people do terrible things and are trying to make money over the good of the people, but it really goes into the detail how that works and their unethical practices. It really investigates all of the sources that it uses in such a strong way, and I really, really enjoyed it for that. There was actually 3 books on that shortlist that I really enjoyed. I forgot about this. The other one was Things I Have Withheld by Kay Miller, and this is a collection of essays that Kay Miller wrote whilst he was living in London and travelling to Jamaica and Ghana and Ethiopia, and growing up as a gay man in Jamaica. And his experience of being part of academic circles and literary circles in London, his experience of that as a black man. One essay that he writes to white women Jamaican writers or Caribbean writers, and that the essays are all kind of things that he is thinking about, ideas that he's having whilst he's going through his life. So he talks about his going back to Jamaica and talking to young gay Jamaican sex workers who take him around, and he talks about their lives and the stories that they tell him. He also talks about his experience going to Ghana and to Ethiopia, his experiences there as being welcomed as a brother, but also his experience of the politics and feeling like an outsider because it's not where he is from, even though there's a certain sense of being from there, but never properly fully being able to know that because of the history of slavery and colonialism. There's also essays about his family that I thought were really wonderful, about things that families hide. There was a line in it, "Maybe that's all family is, the handful of stories we never tell," which I thought was really wonderful. It really resounded with me. I think that his writing, he's a poet, and I was familiar with his poetry before, so there is a sort of rhythm and a feel to his poetry, but to his writing. But more than that, it just feels so like you're inside his head as he is working things out. It's written really well, and it's obviously been very well edited, and it's not like you're reading his actual working things out, but he gives you his thought process and his feelings, and he's not trying to find an answer to anything. He's not telling you this is what I think. He's saying these are some ideas that I have, these are some feelings and experiences and ideas, and this is the way that I am putting together and constructing how I feel about these events, and I'm showing it to you. And I thought it was really wonderful for that. And we have Delusions of Gender by Cordelia Fine. Cordelia Fine is a psychiatrist or psychologist, I can't remember. but she is writing about science, the real science between sex differences, and she is writing a lot about the science that has been produced and the way that it makes assumptions, and the narrative of science, because a lot of the time she talks about how people think of the science as being very like data driven, and the data cannot lie, but how what comes out of data, what's chosen to be studied, the way that it's chosen to be studied, and the way that it is reported on is all narrative, and it is all based on ideas, assumptions, and the world in which we live. You cannot separate science from society. She talks about like how what that science actually says about hardwired differences between male brains and female brains, or even the concept of a male brain and a female brain. She also talks about like neuroplasticity, like the chicken and the egg, like are brains different because we've been raised differently rather than because of the intrinsicness of the brain. She talks about the difficulty of raising children without gender becoming part of their understanding of themselves, the way that it is so hard coded into our world that people are divided into two things, and so the way that gender is made. It is a concept that is constructed by our society rather than something that intrinsically lives within our brain. Like I said, it is a bit of an older book. It is about 12 years old now, and so it is quite binary, which I can kind of understand because it's talking about like the science of brains and the way that that is studied, and that is obviously going to be studied in a binary way. And she's also talking about like societal culture, ideas of gender, which again is going to be quite binary. There isn't any discussion of transness in this book. I wouldn't say it's actively transphobic, it's just ignoring that idea. That concept does not come up, and I can see like it's trying to focus on sex differences but it is also called Delusions of Gender, so there is a little elision there between sex and gender, but I do think it's a really strong book and a really interesting look into the science of brains and the idea of how little we actually know about it. And she's also very funny, which is not something that I get a great deal of from science books, but there is a lot of wit and humour in here, a lot of kind of a wry, sarcastic eye looking at the world. Yes, it is a different day, we're just going to keep going. So the next book on my list is Calypso by David Sedaris, and this is kind of in a different vein to a lot of the non-fiction on this list. It is like comedy, personal essays, kind of. They're very funny. And none of the other books on this list fall into that genre. I'm not really a comedy reader, but I really enjoy David Sedaris's dry wit and his like acerbic style. He is very rude about his family, particularly in this book. It's a series of essays about different things that happen throughout his year. He's an essayist. He writes a lot with these collections of essays. Calypso is the only one that I personally have read, but I definitely want to read some of the others. So there are essays in there about his going shopping in Japan and him and his siblings being like obsessed with buying things, essays about his mother, essays about his relationship with his different siblings and with one of his siblings who has an addiction issue. And about buying a beach house and all of his family going there and like their relationships with one another, which are very fraught and very difficult, but I really enjoyed the way that he approaches them, the way he like doesn't hold back in terms of his opinions on everyone, and he doesn't try to be likable himself. He's very like judgmental and acerbic and rude, but in a very, very funny way. His one about pedometers and getting 10,000 steps I thought was really amusing. And I think that it's a really easy listen. Like if you're just looking for something easy and witty and sharp, a kind of incisive look at the people around him. Like they're all, I don't think they come from a privileged background. As far as I remember, he talks about his background in this book, but they are all like very well off now. And there is a lot of like privilege and like shopping and buying houses and things, but I really enjoy his voice and his sense of humour. As I said, I guess an Oscar Wilde-esque feeling, that kind of wry, insulting absolutely everyone and no one is safe from the insults. Then I think you would enjoy this. I listened to the audiobook of this one as well, and he reads it himself, and I think I'm good to hear the voice and hear the like dry humour in it, and it worked well that way. I think I listened to it over the course of one day. Like I found it really compelling. I also really enjoyed Against White Feminism by Rafia Zakaria. Rafia Zakaria is a Pakistani American lawyer who has worked with the UN in various development programs, and she uses this essay to talk about her experience working with non-profits and with like high up feminist people, liberal feminists in America, and to talk about the ways that white feminism, liberal white feminism, can be ignorant and just as harmful as people who are not feminist, who are from the same perspective of like very wealthy and Western focused. The way that things like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have gone into countries to offer supportive solutions for things that without actually considering the culture into which they're going or what they're bringing. I think it was chickens, and how that actually wasn't very helpful because they didn't consider the cultural context into which they were stepping and the dangers of philanthropy and sort of seeing yourself as a white saviour. She also talks about sex positive feminism and how and the individualist focus of a lot of Western white feminism, how it doesn't focus on groups or collectives and it focuses on our own understandings of ourselves. That kind of choice feminism that can be very harmful as well because it doesn't go into how it works for a collective. It doesn't involve any intersectionality or any concept of cultures different from one's own. She links it back to suffragettes and their relationship with colonialism in the early 20th century, which I found very interesting. I really enjoyed her analysis and I thought that it was refreshing to read a book that didn't feel so like Feminism 101 or very liberal feminist that I feel like a lot of the popular books on feminism can be. But I enjoyed the more like structural critique and almost Marxist critique on class terms that I felt was much more interesting for me than something that would just be about individual rights. Whilst it does talk about rights, it talks about women as a class, and it talks about our lack of colonialism and neo-colonialism and how that affects people living in countries that aren't the West. So I thought it was a very powerful book with a lot of great information, and it's also really short, which I think is helpful for if you want an introduction to ideas of feminism that are not Western and are not focused on the West. I think it's a really interesting one to read. In a similar vein, the last book on this list is Don't Touch My Hair by Emma Dabiri. She talks about similar ideas in terms of her growing up as a mixed race girl in Ireland in the 90s and her experience there, based around hair and the treatment of her because of her hair. Talks about the difference is colorism and how colorism relates to hair and having good hair, and she also talks about hair in relation to braiding and styles and how hair is used to exclude people from things like schools and different workplaces. And also about hair, to talk about history, black history and black culture, the relationships between braiding and algorithms, for example. I found a really interesting chapter. I've read this book again in a very short period of time because I found it so compelling, and the way that it sort of analysed everything I thought was well done. I enjoy it when books like this make connections between disparate things, and I think that centering it on hair and focusing on hair allowed her to go off into different directions but to thematically link everything so that the book doesn't feel like separate, disparate essays. It feels woven together and there is an argument being built across it, which I think is really good. I like her writing style. I found her very analytical, very focused, and also kind of funny and humorous. She brought both sides to it, which I thought was really well done. So I definitely recommend it. Those are the 10 non-fiction books that I have read since starting my channel that I think you should read if you haven't already, if any of those sound of interest. Please do let me know your favourite non-fictions in the comments down below. If any of these reminded you of something that you loved that you think I would like, I would love to hear from you. Remember to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it and to subscribe. I put out new videos twice a week, so I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye!